In the frozen wilderness, when winter's fury stripped everything bare, one man's faith in ancient wisdom proved stronger than the settlers' hurried constructions. A shelter, built not for mere survival, but for communion with the land, would become the key to life when the world outside froze to death. His snow shelter, seen as a folly, stood firm where all else failed. Before we begin, share where you're watching from, and if you're drawn to the stories of the old ways, subscribe, because tomorrow's journey through the heart of ancient wisdom awaits. The wind had begun its dance through the valley by the time the first chill settled over the land. It was early, too early for winter's usual arrival, but there was no mistaking it. The whispers of the land were clear to those who knew how to listen. The animals, thickening their coats, knew it well. The trees, already beginning to shed their leaves, swayed in quiet surrender. The river, which had flowed with easy grace all summer, began to slow its rush, preparing for the inevitable freeze. And among the people, there was one who felt it deeper than most. Tashka stood at the edge of the village, watching as the first snowflakes fell like feathers from the sky. They did not scatter as they usually did, but clung to the earth, heavy with meaning. To him, the snow was not just a sign of winter, but a message. He could hear it in the quiet hum of the wind and feel it in the crispness of the air that settled around his chest. It was as if the land itself was speaking, calling him to heed the coming cold in a way that no one else seemed to hear. He had grown up on stories of winters from long ago, from ancestors who had survived the harshest seasons with only the land to guide them. His father had been a great hunter, and his mother, a keeper of wisdom, had taught him that survival came not just from strength, but from understanding. The land, the seasons, and the spirits that inhabited them spoke to those who were willing to listen. Tashka had always been one to listen. While the settlers around him began their preparations, hastily stacking firewood and reinforcing their cabins, Tashka knew their efforts would not be enough. They were preparing for a winter they expected, one that would be like those they had experienced before. But this winter, Tashka understood, would be different. The land had already begun to shift, and what would come would test them all in ways they could not imagine. The settlers' cabins were being built in haste. They were structures of convenience, put together with the hope that they would endure the cold. But Tashka knew better. The weather would be fierce, and those cabins, though sturdy enough for ordinary winters, would not hold against what was to come. There would be no time to build once the storms hit. The land demanded patience, foresight, and respect. As the others worked, rushing to complete their cabins before the first heavy snow, Tashka took his time. He set out to build something that would last, something that would stand strong when the wind screamed and the cold gripped the land. His shelter would not be a cabin of logs and quick decisions. It would be built into the snow, shaped with care and wisdom from the old ways. The land had always provided. It was time to trust it once more. As the first full blizzard arrived, it was clear that Tashka's shelter had been built for a purpose beyond mere warmth. The wind howled with an intensity that seemed to tear at the land, and the snow fell in thick layers, blanketing the earth in a heavy silence. Yet, within Tashka's shelter, all was still, and all was calm. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, its warmth spreading through the walls built with ancient knowledge. Outside, the settlers scrambled to protect their cabins, those hastily constructed homes that seemed to buckle under the force of the storm. They had built quickly, as was the custom of those who came from distant lands. The cabins were nothing more than simple structures, walls thin and vulnerable to the biting cold. As the storm grew in intensity, the settlers realized their mistake. The firewood that had been gathered with such care was running out, and the warmth inside their homes was fading. Their cabins, though sturdy enough in gentler winters, were no match for this ferocity. Tashka, however, had built differently. His shelter was made for the worst of winters. The snow, thick and insulating, had been layered carefully, packed between the strong branches that formed the framework. Inside, the temperature remained steady, unshaken by the storm that raged outside. The air was fresh and crisp, the warmth from the fire rising into the ceiling, held there by the solid walls. The shelter was not just a refuge, it was an offering to the spirits, a reflection of the unity between the earth, the snow, and the ancient wisdom. The settlers, realizing their cabins were failing, began to search for help. Toshka had warned them earlier, his calm advice dismissed by their pride. "Build for the worst, not just for the ordinary," he had told them. But they had laughed, believing their quick construction would be enough. Now, as they stumbled through the deep snow, cold creeping into their bones, they knew better. Toshka's shelter had stood firm where their own had faltered. As the days passed, Toshka did not turn anyone away. His shelter became a sanctuary for those who had lost their own homes to the storm. They came, shivering and desperate, seeking warmth, and they found it within the walls Toshka had built. The fire burned brightly, and Toshka shared what little food he had, knowing that survival depended not only on the shelter, but on the spirit of generosity that ran deep within the people of his tribe. In the warmth of the shelter, Toshka did not boast. He did not speak of the lessons his ancestors had taught him, though his mind was full of them. The lesson was clear for all to see. Survival was not just about building for today, it was about understanding the future, listening to the land, and respecting its power. The settlers, finally understanding the truth, offered their thanks and asked for his guidance in the future. Toshka's only answer was a quiet smile and the soft sound of the firewood snapping, as if the land itself had spoken through him. The storm lasted for days, its fury showing no mercy. The settlers who had once mocked Toshka now huddled together in their cabins, burning whatever they could find to stay warm. The snow piled up, drifting in thick layers, and the wind whipped the land with such force that the sun seemed to disappear entirely. For days there was no light, only endless white and the relentless howl of the wind. It was as though the earth itself had been swallowed by the storm. Inside their cabins, the settlers fought to stay warm, but the cold seeped in through the cracks. Their hastily built shelters, once thought to be enough, were failing. The fires burned low, and the walls groaned under the weight of the snow that piled up around them. There was no escaping the cold. The settlers, who had once believed they could weather the winter without concern, now realized the full power of the land and the folly of their haste. Meanwhile, Toshka's shelter stood firm. The snow, thick and insulating, kept the cold at bay, while the sturdy structure, built from branches and packed snow, held against the fierce winds. The fire inside remained steady, its warmth filling the space. Toshka moved quietly about his shelter, tending to the fire and making sure his provisions were stored carefully. He had prepared for this moment not because he had known it would come, but because he understood that the land spoke in ways the settlers had yet to learn. As the days wore on, Toshka's shelter became a refuge for more than just himself. Word spread quickly among the settlers that there was a place of warmth, a place where survival could still be found. One by one, they came, struggling through the deep snow, their faces gaunt with exhaustion. They arrived cold, hungry, and broken, but they found warmth in Toshka's shelter. Toshka welcomed them without question, offering them food and the shelter of his home. His actions were not driven by pride or the need for recognition, but by a quiet understanding of the way survival worked in the wilderness. The settlers, once proud and self-assured, now saw in Toshka a wisdom they had ignored. They had thought they could survive the winter with their quick fixes, but now they knew they had been wrong. Survival was not just about speed or materials, it was about respect for the land and the wisdom that came from living in balance with it. Days turned to weeks, and the storm raged on, but in Toshka's shelter the fire burned steady, and the warmth spread through the room. Outside, the world was lost in a blanket of snow, but inside, life continued. The shelter stood as a testament to the power of foresight, built not for the winter they had expected, but for the one they had never imagined. Weeks passed, and the blizzards continued to pound the land. Toshka's shelter stood unshaken, a stark contrast to the broken cabins scattered across the wilderness. The settlers who had once dismissed his methods now gathered within the shelter's walls, grateful for the warmth that had saved their lives. But even in their gratitude, there was an unspoken tension, for the storm had brought with it the harsh truth that their hasty decisions had nearly cost them everything. As the days stretched into weeks, the land began to speak in new ways. The settlers, though grateful for their refuge, began to see the wisdom in Tashka's actions. They spoke less of the storm and more of the land itself. Tashka did not speak of the winter that had come. He did not need to. His presence in the shelter, his quiet understanding of the world around him, was enough. He had built not just for the moment, but for the entire season, knowing that the land would test them all. One evening, as the wind howled against the shelter's walls, Tashka sat by the fire, his thoughts deep in the traditions of his people. His ancestors had known winters like this, and their wisdom had been passed down to him. The settlers, tired and broken, sat quietly around the fire, absorbing the warmth, but it was more than the fire that kept them there. It was the realization that the land had not been an enemy, but a teacher. They had been foolish, thinking they could tame it, that their quick construction and hastily made shelters would be enough. They had not respected the land as they should have. The storm had taken much from them, but it had also given them something invaluable, the understanding of how fragile life could be, in a world that was both beautiful and unforgiving. Outside, the world was a frozen wasteland, but inside, the shelter, there was life. The fire burned brightly, casting long shadows against the walls. The settlers looked to Tashka, their faces filled with a quiet respect. They had come to understand the truth that had been so clear to him from the beginning. Tashka's shelter was not just a refuge, it was a living lesson. The settlers, having learned the hard way, began to speak more of the wisdom of the land, asking Tashka for guidance on how to live in harmony with the earth. The land had tested them all, and those who survived would carry the lessons of this winter forward, knowing that true survival was not about building for the moment, but about understanding the long rhythms of the earth. And so, in the heart of the storm, the lesson was clear. The land gives, but it also takes, and only those who respect it will find a way to survive its harshest tests. The settlers, their pride broken and their hearts humbled, began to realize that their survival in this winter had come not from the strength of their cabins, but from the strength of the land itself and the wisdom of one who had listened to it. As the snow began to thaw and the winds of winter softened, the settlers emerged from the shelter, blinking into the first light of a spring that felt like a rebirth. The storm that had lasted for months had finally broken, leaving behind a landscape that seemed to sigh with relief. The snow, which had buried the earth in white, began to melt, revealing the rich brown soil of the land. The air was warmer now, though still tinged with the cold remnants of winter. The settlers, their faces pale from weeks of confinement, stepped into the open, their eyes wide with the realization of just how much they had endured. Tashka stood at the entrance of his shelter, looking out at the land that had given so much and taken just as much in return. He had known, even in the depths of the storm, that this moment would come when the land would stir with new life and the harshness of winter would be but a memory. But the lessons of the storm, the lessons that came with surviving it, would remain. The settlers, though grateful, were still unsure of how to approach the land now. They had learned to survive the winter, but the lessons of respect and patience had not yet fully settled in their hearts. As they moved about, rebuilding their cabins and tending to what was left of their supplies, they spoke less of the storm and more of Tashka's shelter. Word had spread throughout the community of the young man who had built something that had withstood the worst winter they had ever known. They spoke of his foresight, his quiet wisdom, and the way his shelter had stood firm when everything else had fallen. But Tashka did not seek their praise. He simply continued to live as he had before, in harmony with the land, respecting the rhythms of nature and the teachings of his ancestors. He understood that survival was not a single event. It was a constant journey of learning, of listening to the earth and the spirits that walked with it. The settlers, in their gratitude, began to see that the true strength of Tashka's shelter had not come from the materials he used, but from his deep connection to the land. As spring unfolded, the settlers began to rebuild their homes, this time with more care, more respect for the land that had tested them. Some of them sought Tashka's guidance, asking him how they could make their cabins stronger, how they could live in greater harmony with nature. And Tashka, as always, shared his wisdom, not with words of instruction, but with actions that spoke louder than any lesson could. When the last snow melted and the first flowers bloomed beneath the sun, the settlers knew they had been changed. They had survived the hardest winter of their lives, but it was the lessons they had learned from the land that would stay with them forever. And though Tashka never spoke of it, the community now understood the greatest lesson. Survival was not just about building for the storm, but about living with the land in a way that would outlast even the harshest seasons.